Religion is probably the most powerful generator of collective human identity that the world has ever known. Faith can be important to the individual, but the origins of the very word itself have connotations of binding human beings together, or of the obligations they have to one another within a tradition of faith. That powerful sense of mass belonging is shown in the huge gatherings religions can generate. The largest gathering on earth is the Kumbh Mela, a Hindu festival that takes place every 12 years when pilgrims bathe in the river Ganges. Similar gatherings are seen across faiths, and participants describe an extraordinary sense of connection across nationalities, languages, races and class. Differences melt away as shared beliefs and rituals form strong collective bonds. But as religion creates a strong sense of connection within the group, the danger is it also defines itself against those outside the group. This is where religion becomes tribal, creating an antagonistic relationship between us and them. To explore that, and because of its impact on later history, I want to take the example of Christianity in medieval Europe. For the best part of a millennium, European society was knit together by the common language, rituals and beliefs of Christianity. This famous Ghent altarpiece by Van Eyck beautifully symbolises that. Popes, bishops and monks are gathered together with merchants, scholars and kings in this idyllic landscape with the Gothic architecture of European cities in the background. And all come together around the altar on which is a lamb, the representation of Jesus Christ, the source of their salvation. It's a very idealised scene, and yet there was a darker side to medieval Christendom, because just as this depicts the inside religious group, so outside religious groups were created against whom this Christian culture defined itself. In particular, there was an enemy within and an enemy without. The enemy within was the Jews. Caricatured as greedy and treacherous, the rationale that the Jews had rejected Jesus was used as justification for anti-Semitic persecution across Europe. In England, the Jews were completely expelled in 1290 and not allowed back until under Oliver Cromwell in 1656. The Star of David badges forced on the Jews by the Nazis were prefigured in an edict from the Pope in 1227, and many see the Holocaust as the culmination of this long history of European anti-Semitism. But if the Jews were the outsiders within Europe, beyond its borders to the east, Christendom also defined itself against the Muslim outsider. Most famously, the Crusades were waged against the so-called infidels who ruled over the sacred sites of the Holy Land. Peaceful encounters, such as between Francis of Assisi and Sultan al-Kamil, appear to be the exception. But the problem of religious difference in Europe really exploded when the splits within Christianity itself became uncontainable. Following the Reformation, conflicts between Protestants and Catholic factions proliferated, culminating in the 30 Years' War, which killed a third of the population of the Holy Roman Empire. Bloody religious tribalism had taken hold within Christendom itself. The 30 Years' War ended with the Peace of Westphalia, forging a new accommodation with religious difference in Europe. Religious tensions, of course, remained, but the treaties strengthened the integrity and legitimacy of the state as arbiter over religious difference. Each state could decide their own religious identity, and minority Christian believers within the state were given the right to practice their faith in private. Elizabeth I's famous formulation of that principle some decades earlier was that as long as they submitted to the English crown, we do not make windows into men's souls. So several principles arose out of the Peace of Westphalia that contributed significantly to modern understandings of secularity and in turn to the definitions of acceptable and unacceptable religion that modern secularity generates. First, it established the notion that faith is subordinate to citizenship. In the context, that meant particularly that Roman Catholics had to be loyal to their national governments before Rome. But we still hear that idea today in debates about, for example, whether Muslims in the UK are Muslim first or British first. Second, a corollary of that subordination of faith to citizenship is the notion that religion is primarily a private matter, and the extent to which it should impinge on the public sphere must be limited. The length to which different European countries have taken that principle varies greatly, but even in a nation like England, which has an established church, it's common to hear people say that religion should be kept out of politics. Of course, all this means that the state is accorded the power to limit and regulate religious expression. Some European states are tightening those controls today, requiring that sermons are submitted to government authorities or prohibiting gender segregation on religious grounds. And then, as these principles of modern secularity developed, they became increasingly fused with post-Enlightenment ideas of science and rationalism, often forgetting how much religious thinkers had contributed to this expansion of human understanding. As religion was confined to the private sphere, so the public realm became shaped by the allegedly more rational processes of the market, universal rights, and evidence-based inquiry. This gave rise to the belief, at least among European elites, that as societies progressed, so religion would decline. Religion was deemed to be grounded in ignorance about the world, and human discovery was rendering it redundant. This was the European story of engagement with religion, but as with many European systems and norms, colonialism exported this approach around the world. As new countries emerged from collapsing empires, many adopted this view that to be modern was to be secular. Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, is one of the better-known examples of this. Turning the ancient Ayasofya in Istanbul into a museum was the ultimate symbol of removing religion from the public sphere. My people, he said, are going to learn the principles of democracy, the dictates of truth, and the teachings of science. Superstition must go. Nehru, figurehead of Indian independence, also spoke of secularism, but in a slightly different sense. In the new Indian state, religion was not totally banished to the private realm, but no one religion was given any privilege as a state religion. Well, today the situation in both countries looks very different. Ataturk's secularism has been dramatically rolled back, making way for a far more overt Islamic identity in Turkey. As a powerful symbol of that, President Erdogan has restored worship to the Ayasofya Mosque. Indian secularism has also been reversed, with Hindu nationalists coming into power and asserting their religion as the national religion. And these are just two examples of many countries where religion has once again come to the fore in the public sphere, in cultural identity, in political and social discourse. So the big question is, what has happened? Why do we have this apparent reversal of the trajectory that we have just traced from the Peace of Westphalia? I want to explore three reasons. First, the European model of secularization assumed that the decline in religious affiliation seen in Western Europe would be the universal pattern. This seems not to be the case. Take these pie charts showing the data on global religious affiliation in 2010 and making projections to 2050. The proportions of most of the world faiths are expected to stay about the same, with some growth in the Muslim proportion. But it's the unaffiliated, the non-religious, that are expected to drop from 17% to 13%. This is mostly based on demographics. If Europe is the most secular part of the world, it's also got the lowest birth rates. More religious parts of the world, such as sub-Saharan Africa, are expected to see dramatic growth. Another factor is the decline of communism. It's difficult to get data about religious affiliation in China, for example, but we know it's home to some of the fastest growing Christian communities in the world. So the picture is far more complicated than uniform secularization. A recent report from the International Panel on Social Progress suggested that while some might see this as religious resurgence, it's probably more the case that the old European modernization narratives never fully captured the religious realities of the larger world. Part of decolonizing our understanding of religion around the world is to disentangle ideas about progress and development from ideas about secularity. So religion is not uniformly declining, and it's also clear that the secular state is not always proving to be an effective container of religious difference. And here we're seeing two seemingly contradictory forces. There are forms of transnational religious identity that are undermining the state and weakening its ability to regulate religious expression. And then there are also forms of religion that are fusing with nationalism to reinforce the state, but as a religious rather than secular entity. So to look at that first trend, perhaps the most obvious example in recent years has been the so-called Islamic State, which has crossed the borders of Arab nation states and posed a major threat to their integrity. But technological change and mass migration means that all kinds of religious groups can establish strong bonds across national borders, whether that's Sikh or Hindu groups among the Indian diaspora, or churches whose networks spread around the world. That's one of the difficulties the Chinese state has with Christianity, particularly Roman Catholicism, where links with other nations appear potentially more political. But we also have many situations where populist leaders have harnessed the support of a majority religious community by fusing that religion with the national story in a way that marginalizes minority religions. As we saw, that's happening in India. It's happened in some Christian countries like Poland, Hungary, and the USA under Donald Trump. Several countries have introduced legislation, like Israel's nation-state law identifying the state with one religious group. So the idea of the secular state as the answer to religious difference is not universally successful or even recognised. And then thirdly, picking up on the strength of these religious nationalisms and transnational religious groups, we can say that since the end of the Cold War, the ideas and unitive power of religion have taken on a renewed social force. This was the argument of Samuel Huntington in his book The Clash of Civilizations. The bipolar world of the Cold War, communist and capitalist, was being replaced by a multipolar world based on pre-modern cultural roots. Religion is a primary element in cultural development, and so, he argued, in the modern world, religion is a central, perhaps the central force that motivates and mobilizes people. This image of Vladimir Putin is a good illustration of the power of religion's return as a civilizational narrative. He's not actually in Russia, he's visiting Mount Athos in Greece. Known as the Holy Mountain, it's the ancient centre of Orthodox spirituality. This image, standing in the throne, communicates his leadership of a pan-Orthodox civilization, one of the regions that Huntington identifies. So whether it's this reference to pre-modern Christendom, or ideas in the Islamic world about a worldwide caliphate, or the ancient Buddhist foundations of Myanmar, the big ideas of our religious past are resurfacing around the world. I don't believe Huntington was right to think that this would inevitably lead to clashes, but it certainly seems to be working against our modern principles of universal rights and cosmopolitanism. So what is the way forward in maintaining religious difference peacefully within our societies? Well, we use the phrase global religious pluralities for two reasons. The first is that accommodating religious difference anywhere needs to take account of the global. As we've seen, the interconnectedness and mobility of our societies means that interfaith relations is never just about face-to-face encounters between a local church and a local temple. It connects to global discourses that shape religious identity and community relations around the world. But we also speak of pluralities rather than pluralism, because there isn't one single ism that can solve the problems of religious difference in every context. The Peace of Westphalia led to one model, but different cultures have their own resources for thinking about how religious difference can be acknowledged and held without violent conflict. We will need to draw on all those resources and better understand the way in which religious tensions intersects with the range of global challenges we face today as we seek a more peaceful world.